The void does not announce its hunger. It arrives without warning, a silence that eats the heart of a world until nothing remains but echoes. In the Imperium of man, countless planets shine dimly under the Emperor's light, tethered by faith, war, and the golden beacon of the Astronomican. Yet not all endure his gaze forever. Some are left behind, forgotten by the administratum, consumed by warped storms, or severed in some bureaucratic collapse. These are the abandoned worlds. To speak of them is to speak of slow death, of faith eroded grain by grain, of the gnawing realization that Terra will never answer your plea. Imagine the cathedral bells still tolling in empty plazas, prayers rising to a throne that no longer hears. Imagine the skies growing quiet, not with peace, but with famine, with raiders, with the cold breath of alien predators. This is the fate of worlds abandoned by the Emperor. This is the silence after the hymn. And if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of this tale, into the echoing cathedrals of forgotten faith and broken promises, then walk with us deeper. The Imperium is vast, its tragedies unending. To uncover them, to breathe within them, is to remember what it means to be human at the edge of extinction. So if you wish to journey further into the stories the galaxy hides, give your voice to this archive, share it, let it be heard, and bind yourself to its telling. Only then can we hold the weight of such memories together. The silence did not arrive as a sudden void, but as a slow unraveling of threads once thought unbreakable. On worlds tied to the Imperium, life had always carried the background hum of connection, an astropath's whispered chant bleeding through the air, vox relays flickering with distant confirmations, administratum decrees stamped and carried from orbit to hive. That hum became fragile. The first signs were subtle enough that no one dared to name them, a transmission delayed, an astropath coughing blood and muttering half-phrases instead of visions, the dockmasters reporting fewer merchant hulls threading the void lanes. These were shrugged away as storms in the warp, as delays of bureaucracy, as the burden of patience the faithful must always endure. But patience is not infinite. And when the silence grew thick enough to choke, the world knew it was no mere delay. The Imperium had gone deaf to their cries. At first, the people whispered comfort to themselves. The Emperor does not forget. Terra does not abandon. The Vox will clear. The administratum scribes will resume. The tithe fleets will arrive bearing the familiar sigils of the imperial Aquila. They prayed not as desperation, but as routine, because routine itself was a fortress. Bells still rang in the cathedrals, incense still burned in manufactorum shrines, scribes still dipped their stylus into ink and filed reports to masters who would never read them. But routine falters when it echoes against nothing. A priest raises his voice, and no envoy answers. A governor sends requests stamped with seals, and no reply descends. A family kneels to the shrine, and the lumen globe flickers out because no replacement power core will ever come from orbit. The fortress of routine begins to crumble, one stone at a time. Those who felt it first were the astropaths. Their kind had always dwelt close to madness, their eyes burned by visions of the warp, their tongues cracked from the burden of translating horror into human sound. Yet, in the days of abandonment, their torment deepened. They reached for Terra's beacon, for the Astronomican that burned brighter than any star, but their hands grasped only emptiness. Their screams in the sanctums became nightly rituals, bodies twitching, minds snapping, as silence pressed harder than noise. For the common citizen, the sight of an astropath broken was like seeing the emperor himself close his eyes. What could be more terrifying than the idea that even the psychic choir was unheard? The governors tried to mask the dread. Edicts were proclaimed across the plazas: maintain order, continue tithe collection, keep faith. The administratum scribes, loyal to parchment even in futility, recorded every cargo list, every shipment that would never leave dock, every levy of men who would never be mustered to fight in the emperor's name. Their ledgers became tombstones of ink. Servitors still marched their circuits in the streets, their vox grills droning litanies of productivity, but what they guarded was decay. The cogitators clicked and hummed with figures that no one in the wider Imperium would ever read. A system of obedience continued, like the body of a corpse, twitching with post-mortem spasms. It was the people, the common flesh of the hive, who began to ask questions no priest could silence. Why do the tithe ships no longer come? Why do the administratum adepts still write as if someone waits on the far end? Why does the shrine burn brighter each day while our stomachs grow emptier? Such questions, once whispered in shadows, began to spread like infection. Faith is not only prayer, it is exchange. The people give loyalty, the emperor gives protection. If one side of the covenant rots away, how long can the other endure? And so suspicion crept into daily life. Was it truly the warp storms that silenced Terra, or had the emperor judged this world unworthy? Were they, in truth, forsaken? Priests thundered denial, whipping their congregations into louder hymns, insisting silence was itself a test. Martyrs bled in public squares to prove devotion, their blood painting the stones in patterns that seemed less like symbols of piety and more like stains of desperation. Children were taught new chants at dawn, repeating words that their parents no longer fully believed. The silence became a character itself. It moved through streets like fog. It lingered in manufactura halls where machines slowed to idleness, their gears lacking imported metals. It pressed against the windows of void ports where ships rusted, unable to launch without fuel or spare parts. It entered homes where candles burned longer because the lumen strips had gone dark. Every sound, the scrape of a ration tin, the cough of a miner, the clatter of a failing servitor, was amplified against the backdrop of what was missing: Terra's voice, the emperor's gaze, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself. When silence stretches long enough, it becomes indistinguishable from truth. And in that truth, fear makes new patterns. Families hoarded grain. Gangs formed in the underhive, seizing control of ration distribution once overseen by the administratum. Merchants whispered of alien raiders circling in the void, emboldened by the absence of imperial patrols. Even the skies seemed to dim, for the absence of supply craft meant the orbital docks gleamed no longer with fire trails of descent. The heavens themselves looked empty, barren, like the eye of a god closed in sleep. And in that emptiness, the first stories were born. Rumors whispered that the Adeptus Custodes had walked the streets of Terra in mourning, that the Golden Throne had faltered, that the Emperor himself had turned his face from the galaxy. Of course, no proof existed, no astropath delivered visions true enough to be trusted, but rumor, in the absence of connection, is louder than fact. The people clung to whispers because they needed meaning more than they needed truth, and silence provided no meaning, only void.
The governor's palace, once resplendent in banners of the imperial Aquila, became a fortress of denial. Proclamations issued daily insisted the Imperium still watched, still cared, still marched to their aid. Vox operators transmitted signals into nothing, their voices cracked from endless repetition, calling into a void that returned only static. Administratum scribes died at their desks, faces slumped over parchment, as if death itself was simply another form of unanswered routine. Yet still they wrote, and the silence swallowed every word. The first time I admitted the truth out loud, my voice startled me more than the confession. I was a junior scribe of the Administratum, stamped and sworn to the Ledger Consecratus of Tarsine IX, and my duty was numbers, not truths. My name is Sarah Kest, and I counted the days of silence one inkstroke at a time. At dawn, I would descend through the palace galleries with the other clerks, passing the stained glass of saints and tithed regiments, each pane still glowing with lumen backlighting that coughed and dimmed as the power grids faltered. We filed into the chancery vaults where the data slates waited like rows of votive candles, each one holding the dead ritual of reports. Every morning I entered the tonnage of grain that did not arrive, the promethium that was never offloaded, the astromilitarum levies that mustered into a parade ground devoid of transports. I stamped seals, flagged requests, obeyed the choir of procedure. I told myself that obedience was a bridge over any chasm, but the chasm widened, and obedience could not span it.
The vox galleries above our vaults had once sounded like rain, layered voices, confirmations, acknowledgments, the distant thunder of the Imperium's breath. In the second week of what we stopped calling a delay and could not yet call abandonment, I climbed the iron stair to the galleries and watched the operators at their consoles, hands raw from turning dials that answered with static. A senior adept named Yorun, his scalp tattooed with compact prayers to the master of mankind, kept his lips moving as he sent the same hail to the same void every hour. Ident code of Tarzine 9, priority petition, confirmation request to segmentum command, his cadence even, devotional. His voice cracked on the word segmentum, a tiny fracture in marble. He noticed me in the doorway and, perhaps in need of a witness, beckoned me closer. When he fed the message back to my headset, the return was a flat band of ash. He waited as though a reply might bloom late from that sterility. When none came, he nodded to himself, as if the absence confirmed theorem. "Storms pass," he said, not to me but to the consul. "They pass." The storms did not pass. The astropathic sanctum smelled of burnt copper and salt, as if the sea had boiled inside stone. I saw an astropath there once, a woman named Lysa who wore a veil sewn with the sigil of our world's cathedral. She sat unmoving in her chair while a medicae servitor inclined a cup to her lips, a thin line of water wicking down her chin. Her eyes were empty hollows, sealed long ago, but her face tilted toward the ceiling as if listening for a distant choir. "It's quiet," she whispered into the air. "It's so quiet." The master of choirs, a tall figure robed in leaded silk to dampen the warp's bite, told me that Lysa had given herself to reach for Terra 4 nights running, her mind fraying like old parchment. "She hears nothing now," he said. "Sometimes nothing is worse than screams." Outside the sanctum, the streets learned the vocabulary of want. The ration bells still rang through the hive's tiers, but their echo reached farther than the bread they promised. Administratum wagons rolled out with crates marked for hablocks, only to be intercepted by gangs whose loyalty to imperial edict dissolved faster than lumen filament under overload. The Adeptus Arbitas deployed shock formations to keep the arteries clear, black carapace armor reflecting candles and smoke, but their numbers could not be everywhere at once. When the Arbitas moved, order formed behind them like frost. When they passed, it thawed into the same hunger and the same predatory smiles.
I watched from a balcony as a ration line broke into a stampede, the neat columns dissolving as a rumor surfaced that the crates held meat. They did not. They held flour in sacks that burst like pale clouds when torn. Men and women fought in that dust, faces chalked, teeth bared like statues suddenly taught to bleed. In the manufactora, the machine priests intoned binheric prayers over assembly lines that stuttered and stopped. Tech priest Varana, whose mechadendrites moved with the poise of a conductor's hands, summoned me once to record a requisition that would never be filled: replacement tribor lathes, sacred unguents, a Skitarii contingent to guard the temples of iron. She recited the litany, and I wrote it all, though we both knew the words would go nowhere. Around us, the mechanisms exhaled heat without purpose. A servitor, patched and pitted, resumed its circuit, dragging a cart of cog-teeth blanks that would never become rifles. Its vox grill wheezed a worship phrase at each shrine niche, the syllables hollowed by repetition. Productivity sustains the Imperium. Productivity sustains. The echo lingered after it crawled away, a ghost of obedience haunting a hall that could no longer pretend to be alive. At the governor's levee, Lord Governor Marcia Vale received delegations as if the galaxy beyond the palace walls were orderly and attentive. She wore the mantle of office over a breastplate polished to a mirror, and flanked herself with banners depicting the imperial aquila, the claws paired in perfect symmetry above her throne dais. Petitioners knelt and rose, a choreography as old as our tithe books. The governor's master of offices called upon me to summarize the week's figures. I read them aloud with steady tone. Void traffic nil. Prometheum reserves at 32 days under current ration. Astra Militarum transports grounded. Adeptus Mechanicus requests pending without reply. Ecclesiastici requesting additional grain allotment for pilgrimage houses. And the governor nodded like a scholar hearing a lecture on familiar doctrine. When I finished, the master of offices announced that order would be maintained, faith reinforced, vox suites expanded. The words fell into the air and lay there, gleaming and useless, like metals pinned to a corpse.
I learned to measure fear by sound. In the upper hive, fear spoke in the hush that followed the bells, a calculation of how far a ration might stretch, how many candles remained, whether the lift cars would stall between tiers again. In the mid-habs, fear cracked like glass when Arbites' boots rolled past, then mended itself into whispers as the boots receded. In the underhive, fear was loud, profane, and immediate, expressed in the laughter of those who had found an angle and the guttural chorus of those who had been shut out. I rarely went below the manufactora levels, but once, sent to certify a failed cogitator bank in an archive annex, I missed the return lift and had to take the stair galleries that plunged like wells. The metal carried the weight of footsteps far away. The air tasted of oil, rust, and the faint sweetness of rot. A child ran past me barefoot, clutching a ribbon of lumen wire as if it were a ribbon of gold. Her breath smoked in the cold, and her eyes were too old. A rumor began to coil through the city. Xenos Miasma's edge lights had been seen in the night sky, faint as fever phantoms, and void wardens at the docks swore on their families' bones that a long-range auspex pinged shapes without imperial transponders. The dock mistress, an iron-haired woman named Corin Hall, brought me her statement to file, the parchment stamped with her sigil ring so hard the wax cracked. She wanted it known that she had asked for militia musters to be raised, for the planetary defense guns to be reconsecrated and tested, for Mechanicus crews to recalibrate the ancient macro batteries that slumbered in their bastions. The notice went where all our notices went, into the vault of dutiful nothing. But I watched her step from the chancery with a steadiness I envied. Some people, when silence takes the world, begin to speak with their hands. The ecclesiarchy swelled to fill the vacuum left by missing answers. Sermons doubled in length and fervor, and the cathedral's high nave became a reservoir of grief and heat. I stood once at the rear of a congregation so huge that people climbed the columns to see. Father Hierophant Uriel crossed the nave with a torch that burned blue, the smoke tracing the ribbed vaults like a map of convulsions. "The Emperor tests," he boomed, his voice echoing along the bones of the city.
He withdraws his hand that we may strengthen our grip. He gestured toward a line of penitents kneeling along the central aisle, their backs welted with fresh lash marks. A woman fainted and rose again to kneel harder. I was not immune to such theater. My throat tightened, my eyes burned, and for a moment the world felt coherent if cruel. But when the smoke thinned and the hymn ended, we stepped back into the same corridors with the same dead consuls. When the first astropath died, the bells did not ring. The master of chorus requested discretion, and so the sanctum doors closed and the corpse was prepared with lead and prayer. Lysa's veil was folded on her chest, the sigil stitched there, now a symbol that meant nothing when applied to communications. I signed the death certificate and filed it among hazard reports and requisitions. A servitor in the mortuary chapel flickered and stuttered, its picked screen face briefly showing a still of Terra's outline before collapsing inward to a smear of light. I found myself speaking to Lysa without intending to. I said into the quiet, "If you hear anything, send it back." My voice sounded small among the iron and stone. The day after, Doc Mistress Hall's rumor matured into a silhouette. On the outer aspect scopes, a scar and the stars moved with will. The macro battery bastions, cold for years outside ceremonial firings, groaned as sacred oils found dried seals, and machine spirits were coaxed awake with chimes and code. I was not present on the ramparts, but I heard the distant, ancient thrum of capacitors filling, the sound like a mountain remembering it was also a cannon. In the chancery vaults, the data slates flickered as power was diverted, glyphs smearing into ghostly trails before stabilizing. The master of offices signed a mobilization order. The seal impressed perfectly, golden aquila crisp against red wax, the image of authority unmarred by the knowledge that no authority watched it from beyond our sky.
Night fell on Tarsine 9 with a clarity I had not seen since childhood. With the void lanes quiet, the heavens were simply black, unconcerned. I went to the palace roof, where a handful of off-duty Arbites stood with helms clipped to belts, faces turned upward. One handed me a tin cup of recaf brewed so thin I could see the bottom. We said nothing because words felt like artifacts from a different age. Then, across the dark, a star moved against the pattern and left a faint, malign smear. Someone drew breath too sharply. Far out where the auspex spoke and men pretended they could understand, something approached without a name we could understand, and the macro battery's machine spirits trembled awake like beasts in chains. The auspex record was brief, almost trivial in its phrasing, but it spread through the palace like a toxin. A contact of uncertain origin, mass, indeterminate, no transponder recognized by Imperial protocol. For years, even decades, the skies above Tarsine 9 had carried only the familiar signatures of tithe ships, freighters, and administratum carriers. Now, with silence reigning, the appearance of something unknown ignited every fear that had been waiting just below the surface. Some whispered it was Xenos raiders, emboldened by our isolation. Others muttered it was a rogue trader fleet smelling weakness. And a few, those given to superstition, declared it was punishment. Phantoms in the void come to collect the debt of a world already forsaken. The macro batteries woke slowly, their machine spirits reluctant, their massive coils trembling as if remembering a song they had not sung in centuries. I was summoned with the other clerks to witness the rites of ignition, to stamp the litany records and confirm each firing order. The tech priests had gathered in crimson procession, mechadendrites shivering in anticipation, their metallic voices rising in Benharic hymns. Sparks dripped from their censers, sacred oils burned acrid in the night, and the great cannon mouths groaned open like the jaws of stone giants. Even in that moment, as I felt awe ripple through the gathered crowd, I knew it was theater as much as defense. The macro batteries might fire, but who would they kill? And who would come to avenge us if the enemy was something the Imperium had already forgotten?
On the streets, fear found new shapes. Arbite's patrols tightened, Vox broadcasts announced curfews, and yet no one could restrain the flow of rumor. In taverns and shrines, in manufacturer canteens and ration lines, the people spoke of what they thought they had seen. Lights moving in the night sky, shadows streaking across the moons, augur ghosts shaped like wings, like blades, like teeth. I overheard one merchant declare that orcs had returned to harvest flesh for their endless wars. Another swore it was necrons risen from tombs beneath our own soil. A miner spat in disgust and said they were only pirates, no better and no worse than men like us. None of them knew, but all of them believed. Belief was easier than silence. I began to dream in static. The Vox channels, endlessly empty, filled my sleep with whispers I could not understand. I awoke each morning with the taste of iron on my tongue, like blood or rust, and my hands shook as I dipped the stylus in ink. Around me, the chancery vault grew thinner each day, fewer clerks arriving, more desks sitting idle. Some deserted into the underhive, where life at least had the clarity of violence. Others were simply gone, their absence recorded by no one. And still we wrote, still we stamped, still we filed. The illusion of continuity was the only shield left. When the first alarms rang from the orbital docks, we ran to the terraces to see. A line of fire traced itself across the black, an atmospheric entry, something real, not rumor. For a moment, the entire hive city seemed to pause. Tens of thousands of eyes lifted to the heavens, united in a single breath of expectation. If it had been a fleet of the Imperium returning, if banners had unfurled with the Aquila, if voices had thundered through the Vox with reassurance, perhaps we might have believed the silence was broken. But the falling light carried no heraldry. It struck the upper atmosphere, broke into shards like burning glass, and fell into the seas beyond the horizon. No signal followed. No message came.
The governor stood before her people that night and proclaimed that the emperor tested their resolve. She spoke in words that echoed like chimes of brass, strong and unwavering, but her eyes, those of us close enough to see them, betrayed a flicker of the same hollow terror we carried in our own bones. She knew, as we all did, that we were alone, and when a world knows itself abandoned, even for a breath, something breaks that no sermon, no decree, no ritual can fully mend. And so the first chapter of abandonment closed, not with a scream, nor a final desperate cry, but with the deeper quiet that follows false hope. The silence had become absolute. The Imperium was gone, and whatever waited in the void was now ours alone to face. The first hunger was not in the stomach, but in the air, a thinning of the world's breath that turned every corridor into a lung that could no longer fill. Power-saving cycles cut the hive's lumen strips to a dim dusk even at noon, and the manufacturer throttled themselves to a crawl, as if ashamed to be heard consuming more than a whisper of energy. Ration bells, those old metronomes of obedience, kept time with the confidence they no longer deserved. When they rang, entire tiers tilted toward them, and the press of bodies transformed plazas into organs of need. I learned to walk with my elbows close and my chin down, the way a clerk moves through a flood without giving it her name. But I could not ignore the new smell that clung to everything: sour grain, burnt oil, and the metallic tang of fear, as if someone had scraped rust into the recaf. Dock Mistress Corin petitioned again for militia musters, and this time the governor allowed it. The decree went out with a voice of brass, and men and women reported to drill squares with jackets 2 sizes too big and las guns that had not been indexed since the last tithe parade.
Veterans of the Astra Militarum, those who had kept their discipline like a talisman after mustering out, tried to teach the new formations how not to die in the first hour. They bellowed about cover and fields of fire, about how to hold a line when your hands stop listening to orders and begin listening to tremor. But the militias drilled on empty stomachs, and hunger is the most persuasive enemy on any field. When the day's instruction ended, many slipped away to hunt for additional ration chits, and some did not return. The Arbites caught a handful and made examples in the plaza below the chancery. The lesson took like a brand at first light, then faded by noon. In the manufactura, tech priest Varana banned the word shutdown and replaced it with sacral pause, as if language could bully reality back into compliance. Her Skitari guardians, thin, tireless figures with augmetic eyes like candle flames, paced the gantries with ritual precision, but even they could not conjure materials that were no longer on our world. A line assembling autogun magazines shuddered to a halt when the last spool of stamped steel unraveled. Another producing plow fixtures for the agrateers died quietly as an old man alone. I watched Varana stand over a bank of cogitators, mechadendrites furled like exhausted wings. When she saw me, she asked for another requisition to be recorded. Replacement alloys, sacred machine oils, a prayer-engraved shipment of precision tools from a forge world's name she spoke like a benediction. I wrote, and in writing felt complicit in a lie so gentle it did not even bruise. The second hunger arrived in the intestine. It was ordinary at first, a missed meal's ache. Then it bit through conversation and sleep with teeth you could count. The ecclesiarchy opened soup lines that were not soup. Thin broth swirled with a shimmer of fat so slight you might have called it a memory rather than a substance. Father Hierophant Uriel preached as he stirred, each turn of the ladle a cadence in a litany about endurance. A boy beside me asked whether patience had calories. I could not unhear it. Pilgrims came to the cathedral steps to exchange heirlooms for bread, regimental medals, a rusted family shrine reliquary, a scarf woven with the names of dead sons. Uriel took none of it, to his credit, and gave out the broth until the cauldron's bottoms shone like mirrors. When the last ladle fell empty, he raised the pot so the crowd could hear the clean ring of metal, as though to prove that absence could be honest.
Tradition followed absence as night follows evening. At first, it wore human faces we already knew. Racketeers, who had always lingered at the shadow margins, stepped fully into daylight. They found new markets in the gaps where administratum supply once flowed. They sold lamp oil cut with promethium so thin that stoves coughed and died. They stretched recaf grounds with scorched grit that wore teeth down to small, careful stones. They took payment in chits, in heirlooms, in favors, and when those ran out, in flesh. The Arbites moved on them with shock mauls and unwavering lines, and sometimes the law bit clean. But the law has few teeth when the world itself begs to be eaten. The third hunger came from above. Auspec's shrieks knifed through the night, and the macro batteries answered with a thunder that rattled the chancery vaults and shook flecks of paint from saints' halos in the cathedral nave. We stood on terraces with our breath turning to pale ghosts and watched streaks of light trade places with pieces of the sky. Some of the lights blossomed into ugly flowers and died. Others sketched inland and went to ground with the kind of finality that makes a hive city flinch without knowing why. At dawn, militia patrols returned with faces as blank as primer. They spoke of drop caskets cracked open on the salt flats beyond the agrateers, of hull fragments scraped clean of heraldry, of footprints that were not quite human leading away into scrub and slag. One patrol brought back a survivor they had pulled from a shattered pod, a man with a vox grill grafted into his throat and teeth filed smooth like ceramic.
He had no ident tags and no words that weren't laughter. The Medici could not decide whether to call him pirate or mad. Lord Governor Marcia Vale moved her command from the audience hall to a chamber carved into the palace's spine, a room built for sieges and omens. From there, she stitched together a defense grid out of things that were not designed to touch. Macro batteries with anti-ship targeting slaved to city-wide auspex webs. Militia pickets anchored by 2 battered Astra Militarum field guns that had once fired blanks for parades, and a tangle of Vox relays cannibalized from a dozen civilian towers. When I carried updated casualty numbers to the chamber, paper, because the data slates were rationed more rigorously than food, I watched her trace lines on a wall map with a gauntleted finger. She did not tremble. The Master of Offices stood at her shoulder with a face like a mask hammered from duty. I understood, suddenly, that they were playing regicide with a board that changed shape whenever their hands left it. The fourth hunger was for certainty. Rumors had never moved faster. Some said orcs had landed in the ruins of the old Manufactorum Quarter, that green-skinned raiders were already welding up gun trucks from our dead machines. Others swore that Necron scarabs had shittered out of a rent in the earth by the salt flats and turned 3 militia squads to statues of ash. I heard a story about a void ship silhouette drifting just beyond the reach of the planetary guns, watching with the patience of a surgeon deciding where to cut. None of these carried proof. Proof was a luxury of connected worlds. We had only testimony and a silence against which to shout it. Still, the dock mistress sealed a dozen landing pads and chained the remainder, and the palace sent Arbites to stand with her. When I asked Corin Hall, later, what she had actually seen, she answered with her hands on the rails, eyes on the dead docks. She said, "Enough. Enough to bolt every door I own." The Agri-Tears were the first true wound. Lower yields had been a whisper for months, a line in my ledgers that I rounded down with embarrassed hope. Then the tractors stopped. A single bearing in a single drive chain failed, and there was no replacement that fit. A day later, a filter burned out in a cogitator that regulated irrigation, and the machine spirits sulked and refused all coaxing. The Mechanicus hauled offerings out to the fields, censers, chimes, votive plates inscribed with binary couplets, and appeased what they could. But the truth hunched over the soil like a tired god. Without parts, even miracles are brief. I walked the tiers with a clerk's clipboard like a shield, and watched grain stalks yellow too soon. Watched hydroponic panes go cloudy from coolant they could not replace. Watched workers cut corners, because corners were all that remained to cut. A woman named Eva showed me her hands and joked that callus was a kind of glove. Then she coughed, and did not stop until her lips shone red. Predators outside our skin grow bold, and so did the ones inside. Administratum seals became currency overnight, because a parchment ribbon with a red wax aquila still parted crowds where nothing else did. The first time someone offered to buy my seal, 5 ration chits and a strip of dried meat that might have been from a sumpeel, I laughed with more scorn than I had earned. The second time I hesitated. The third time I went home and hid the seal in the hollow behind a shrine tile and hated myself for the trembling that lingered in my fingers. Father Uriel said from the pulpit that weakness acknowledged is strength's beginning. I wanted to believe him. Instead, I believed the arithmetic that marched in my belly every time the bells rang. Manufactora sirens began to cry not in warning but in mourning. A long falling note that slid down the scales of the tier and ended as a cough of steam. I marked the closures in my ledger until the ledger itself felt like an assassin. Each entry killed someone I did not know yet, but would meet in a ration line, in a shrine, on a corner where Arbites stood with visors down like black eyelids. Sarah Kest, scribe of the Ledger Consecratus of Tarsine 9, clerk of things that cannot be fed. The title fit like a collar. The city learned to keep its head bowed so the collar's edge would not chafe. And then, on a morning bruised purple by a failing grid, the auspic shrieked again, this time close enough that the palace windows rang. Militia squads scrambled, Arbeits Voxnets filled with clipped orders, and I found myself running with a folder pressed to my chest, though I had nowhere to deliver it. On the far horizon, over the agri-tiers that had already begun to die, something moved like a dark hand closing. It shed smaller shadows that fell toward us like seeds. I did not know what they were. I only knew they were hungry. The seeds that fell from the void did not bloom into firestorms or thunderous assaults. Instead, they broke open like shells in the soil, their contents spilling quietly into the land. Patrols that ventured out to confirm never returned whole. Some came back bleeding and silent, dragging comrades who could not be saved. Others returned babbling with stories too fractured to stitch into sense, shadows moving against the light, shapes that dissolved when struck, and voices on the wind that spoke with human tones though no mouth could be found. The governor's chamber filled with casualty reports written in trembling hands. I filed them until my fingers numbed, and when the ink blurred I realized it was not the page that shook, but me. Hunger gnawed deeper, more insistent than rumor, more certain than fear. The agri-tiers could not bear their diminished harvests, and the manufactura that once supplied nutrient paste had fallen to stillness. People traded in hours of labor for scraps, whole families bartering days of work for a single loaf. Violence erupted not in the shadows but in the light of plazas where ration wagons arrived. The Arbeits raised their shields, forming walls of black carapace as mobs crashed against them. I saw a child crushed beneath that weight, her hand flung outward, still clutching a ration chit as though it might yet be redeemed. I had to record the riot as a statistical anomaly in the Chancery ledger, one incident among many. The number could not weep, but I did. Predators sensed weakness, and weakness invited them in. Raiders descended in fractured waves, pirates or worse, cutting into the hive's veins. The macro batteries roared, their machine spirits jubilant at last to hurl death into the heavens, but for every fireball traced in the skies, another ship slipped through. They came like crows to a battlefield, not to conquer, but to feast. Docks burned, manufactura quarters filled with smoke, and Arbeits precincts fought desperate sieges behind shuttered gates. The governor's voice thundered across the Vox, demanding unity, demanding faith, demanding endurance. But her proclamations carried the brittle sound of glass struck too hard.
I remember one night when the Chancery Vault's doors slammed open and a squad of militia stormed in, their uniforms half-fastened, their eyes wild with fatigue. They demanded requisitions for munitions that no longer existed, papers stamped to authorize weapons we had never possessed. Their leader, a woman with blood dried in the crease of her neck, slammed her fist against my desk so hard the ink pot tipped, blackening the casualty sheets. "Write it," she snarled. "Write that the Emperor still provides." And I did, because what else could I do when the truth was more useless than the lie? In the underhive, something worse bloomed than raiders or hunger. Men who had tasted starvation too long began to hunt each other. Whispers spread of cook fires that burned too hot, of smoke too sweet, of bones left stripped in alleys where scavenger dogs would not go. The Arbeits raided dens and came back pale, and the priests thundered that cannibalism was the deepest heresy, proof of abandonment. But heresy is another word for survival, when survival is the only altar left. And above it all, silence reigned. No reply from Terra, no salvation from the void, no crusade descending to lift us back into the Emperor's light. Only the slow attrition of hunger, the slow circling of predators, and the slow realization that we were no longer a world of the Imperium, but a carcass, and the scavengers had arrived to feed. The world seemed to shrink as hunger and violence drew their noose tighter,
Streets that had once thrummed with commerce turned into arteries of fear, narrow and tense, every step weighed against the risk of being seen carrying something edible. I watched families huddled together in silence, bowls empty, but still set on the table as though ritual itself might conjure food. Some clung to prayers with cracked lips, their voices lifting into the stagnant air, begging the emperor for his gaze to return. Others spat on the stones outside the cathedral and turned away, their faith collapsing like a star imploding under its own gravity. The manufactura ceased one by one, like candles extinguished in a slow wind. Where once servitors clattered tirelessly, their arms stitching metal to metal, their voices droning hymns of labor, now silence lingered. A handful kept moving, powered by momentum more than directive, dragging their carts in circles, sparks falling from failing joints. In the halls of rust, echoes replaced industry. I passed through once, called to verify the closure of a machine line, and the stillness haunted me more than the riots or the battles. It felt like walking among tombs where the dead had not yet realized they were dead. The governor's decrees grew harsher as the pressure mounted. Curfews shortened the day into a few brief hours, and punishments multiplied like weeds. Thieves were flayed in public squares to prove the law remained unbroken. Deserters were nailed against ration posts as if their bodies could remind the people what order looked like. But order was already bleeding out. The Arbeit stretched too thin began to fracture. Squads took orders from their precinct captains rather than the governor's chamber, and when resources ran dry, they guarded their own halls above all else. Some precincts became fortresses, black-armored citadels bristling with law that no longer served the world beyond their walls. Raiders pressed harder with every cycle, their landers darting into manufactura ruins and dockyards, feeding off the chaos. The militia, brittle from hunger, fought with desperation but lacked unity. Entire cohorts vanished in the night, either slaughtered in ambush or dissolved back into the underhive. A rumor spread that one regiment had even defected, selling its weapons to the raiders in exchange for safe passage off-world. Whether true or not, the rumor struck deeper than any blade, because it revealed what all of us already knew. The bonds that held us together were unraveling, and loyalty was becoming another ration to be spent.
And then, as though the void itself wished to mock us, the auspex screens lit with signals too numerous to count. The macro batteries fired until their chambers smoked, their machine spirits wailing with both ecstasy and exhaustion. Entire sectors of the hive blacked out as power was diverted to the guns. We watched from terraces as streaks of light crisscrossed the heavens, blossoms of fire blooming in silence. To those on the ground, it seemed almost beautiful, like a festival in the sky. But beauty does not feed, and when the guns fell quiet, when the smoke drifted away, the raiders still came. They slipped through the cracks, as they always had, and fell upon us with renewed hunger. By the time the alarms fell silent again, the hive was no longer the same. Blocks smoldered where bombs had fallen, ration depots stood looted and empty, and the once proud banners of the Aquila drooped in soot and blood. I remember walking home through the ruins of a plaza, the marble cracked and blackened, the statue of St. Galleria toppled and half buried in rubble. A single hand jutted from beneath her fallen form, not bronze, but flesh. A child's hand, limp, still clutching a rosary bead. That night, I stopped writing in the ledgers, not because there were no numbers left to tally, but because the numbers no longer meant anything. Hunger had consumed the city, and ruin had made predators of us all. We were not part of the Imperium anymore. We were carrion, waiting for teeth to find us. I learned that faith breathes differently when it has to keep a body alive. Before the silence, piety in the hive had been an architecture, arches and incense, the weight of the cathedral's nave pressing our chests into reverence. After hunger and ruin, faith became a pulse. It throbbed at ration lines where people traced the sign of the Aquila on empty bowls, at manufacturer altars where tech priests etched binary litanies into dead steel, at street corner shrines hammered together from scrap. I began to carry a scrap charm myself, a sliver of brass stamped with a half-formed Aquila, not because I believed it worked, but because my fingers needed something to worry besides the edges of my guilt. The cathedral endured like a ship's keel when the hull is gone. Father Hierophant Uriel's sermons lengthened as the city shortened its days, his voice roughened by smoke and the duty to fill so much absence with words. He spoke of the emperor's trial by withdrawal, of a love that tested by distance, and the nave swelled with 1,000 small agreements, each one a nod made in defiance of what our eyes declared. The faithful burned tallow made from sump eels, and pressed their foreheads to cold stone that remembered the warmth of better years. Martyrs came forward more readily now, men and women who understood that a suffering you choose can feel cleaner than the suffering you are given. They knelt with backs bared and offered their skin to penance. The lash marks were angry red at first, then glazed over with a sheen like lacquer, a script the city could read as proof of belonging. But belief is not a single river. It braided into channels that cut their own beds through the rubble. A group began to gather in the Manufactorum quarter, where the machine temples still smelled of oils too sacred to burn. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the True Signal, and their chants were thin, metallic things that made teeth itch. They argued that the Astronomican had dimmed not because the emperor had turned his face away, but because our prayers were angled wrong. We have whispered into the wrong ear, one told me, when I paused at their threshold with a scribe's curiosity I could no longer discipline. They offered me a brass token punched with an array of holes like a cogitator's memory plate. Align yourself, he said, as if the galaxy were an abacus one might set straight with a fingertip.
Not all deviation wore kindness. A sect calling itself the Penumbral Choir moved through the mid-habs with lamps hooded and blades bright. They whispered that the Adeptus Custodes had descended upon Terra in sorrow and extinguished the Astronomican with their own hands to spare the Emperor further suffering. Rumor layered on rumor until the story's edges blurred into a bruise the city could press for pain. The choir cut Aquilas from banners and folded them into black birds which they loosed from high bridges. The birds fluttered down like omens. The Arbites hunted the sect and managed to corner a cell in a stairwell whose echo remembered better footfalls. But 3 precinct troopers bled out before the last hooded voice fell silent. The precinct captain said over the vox that heresy proliferates like mold when light is rationed. No one laughed. Within the palace, the governor convened a council that was equal parts liturgy and logistics. Father Uriel stood opposite tech priest Verona, brass and blood debating with iron and oil about which rituals could be spared to feed the guns and which prayers were necessary to feed the people. I was there to tally shipments that failed to exist and record compromises that would wither before they reached the door. Verona argued that devotion must be measured in uptime and working tolerances. Uriel answered that a city without a soul would fight like a corpse. Their disagreement never resolved, but it created a current that carried us for weeks. The Mechanicus yielding a valve here, the ecclesiarchy releasing a crate of tithes there, the governor threading a seam down the middle and calling it a plan. I found myself praying without words. In the chancery vault between casualty lists and requisitions, my lips moved in a motion I could not name. I did not ask for rescue. I asked for less shaking in my hands, for the courage not to sell my seal, for the discipline to keep my ledgers honest, even when numbers had become a language for cruelty.
When I signed the death certificate of a ration clerk who had starved because she had given her allotment to her sons, I pressed my palm to the parchment and held it there until the warmth leached away. I imagined that pressure crossing the void like a signal, however faint, and touching something golden that might, just might, still be awake. The relic trade thickened until it felt like a second economy. Cogwheels with devotional nicks became pilgrim coins. Broken lass cells with saints' faces scratched into their casing fetched more in barter than a knife. An old guardsman came to the chancery with a regimental standard rolled in oilcloth, its colors faded to the memory of flame. He wanted me to certify its provenance so he could trade it for grain. I could not lie for him, not even then, but I could put my signature on a copy of his story and mark it with the Aquila so that anyone who saw the document might feel the weight of the thing he sold. He left lighter, and I hated that there was relief in the space grief vacated. In the nights when the macro batteries did not fire, the city dreamed louder. Voices rose from stairwells and courtyards, liturgies colliding in the air until they formed a weather system of supplication. Somewhere, a choir practiced a hymn whose melody drifted like smoke through cracked windows. Somewhere, a Scitarius recited a maintenance catechism over a rifle that had no charge. Somewhere, a child counted prayer beads that belonged to a mother who would not return. I walked home under those sounds and felt small in a way that was not only terror. It was also an old species of belonging, stripped of pageantry, raw and animal. And I understood why people tied charms to door handles and painted tiny Aquilas on the inside of their wrists. We wanted the Emperor to see us. Failing that, we wanted to see each other seeing. One evening, Dock Mistress Corin Hal took me to the roof of a sealed hangar and pointed toward the night where the docks lay black and quiet. She told me without ornament that a light had blinked there 2 nights running. Once, then again, a patient pulse. Not a transponder, not a ship, a signal. I stared until my eyes watered, and of course I saw nothing. But I carried that claim like a candle, cupped in both hands. The rumor moved through the hive by morning, accumulating prayers as it went. The Brotherhood of the True Signal said it proved their angle was correct. Father Uriel said it was a test of discernment. Mother Rahl sent her people to stand on rooftops so that if the light came back, the city would not meet it alone.
When the light did return, it was not on the docks at all, but in the sky over the Agritiers, where the soil had hardened into a map of hunger. A single flare blossomed white, and then narrowed into a steady, thin star that pulsed as if it had a heartbeat. The militia called it a targeting lure and moved to ground their squads. The Mechanicus called it an augury artifact and sent Scitari to triangulate. The ecclesiarchy called it a sign and flooded the fields with pilgrims, candles guttering in the wind. I stood between those tides and tasted the air. It tasted like cold iron and wet stone. I did not know what the light meant, but I knew that whatever it would be made into a meaning before dawn. The light over the Agritiers burned for 3 nights before it faded, and each night it divided us further. Pilgrims saw in its steady pulse the Emperor's affirmation, a reminder that he had not forgotten, and they prostrated themselves in the fields until their skin blistered from the cold. The militia claimed it was a lure, a trick cast into the void by raiders to bait us into scattering. The Mechanicus argued bitterly that it was a machine code transmission, meant to be read as logic rather than prophecy. I stood beneath it once, wrapped in my thin cloak, and felt the ache of hunger in my belly and the heavier hunger in my chest. I wanted it to be a sign. I wanted it to mean that the Emperor had looked this way again. But meaning is a currency minted by need, and we were all too poor to be honest. Father Hierophant Uriel preached until his voice cracked.
climbing to the cathedral roof so his silhouette could stand beneath the mysterious star. "You doubt?" he cried, his torch sputtering in the night air. "Doubt is weakness, and weakness is a gate through which damnation enters. The Emperor's silence has never meant absence. It is trial, it is tempering. He watches as the smith watches the blade and fire, waiting to see which of us warps and which of us endures." His words struck the crowd like hammers, and their cheers rose ragged, desperate, fierce. I saw children carried on shoulders, hands raised toward the light, as though they might pluck it down, and I knew that if the light vanished tomorrow, they would still believe they had seen his hand. But in the manufacturer quarter, the Brotherhood of the True Signal sang their own hymns, each word a cold line of Binharic chant, each syllable vibrating like the hum of failing cogitators. They insisted the flare was a beacon coded for them alone, proof that the galaxy itself could be tuned if only we angled our prayers correctly. When I challenged them, timidly, more curious than defiant, they smiled, as though pitying a child. "You are scribes of dead ledgers," one said. "We are scribes of what comes." They lit their own fire on a manufactorum roof, a green flame fed by oils not meant to burn, and when the fumes spread through the air, I heard people coughing like supplicants in a litany too costly to sustain. Faith twisted tighter with every day of hunger. Cults flourished not because they convinced, but because they promised. Some promised return, some promised transformation, some promised vengeance on Terra itself for its silence. In alleys, painted Aquillas were defaced into symbols I could not read. In the shrines, holy water was replaced with sump runoff, blessed only by desperation. And yet, in the middle of all that blasphemy and fracture, I saw true moments of grace. Mothers dividing crusts 3 ways with smiles that lied only to comfort. Old men giving up their rations so the young could march 1 day longer. Arbatized troopers pausing in their grim patrols to leave offerings at street corner shrines. Even as faith mutated, it refused to die. The light disappeared on the 4th night. No flare, no pulse, only the familiar black dome of the Emperor's absence. The city awoke to whispers and wails. Some tore their charms from their wrists, cursing the priests. Others declared the test complete, that the Emperor had measured and would soon arrive. And still others, eyes red with grief, said nothing at all, for words had lost their power. I went to the chancery that morning and found the ledgers damp with condensation, as though even the walls wept with the weight of silence. And yet, when Father Uriel walked into the nave that evening, thousands followed him. When the Brotherhood sang in their manufactura temples, hundreds echoed their metallic chants. When Mother Rawl whispered her rust-born visions in the underhive, the desperate pressed close to hear. Faith persisted because it had to. It was the last fuel we had left, and whether it burned clean or poisoned the air, we could not afford to let it go out.
The final days of that season of faith were painted in both fire and silence. I remember standing in the nave of the cathedral as Father Uriel led a procession, his voice little more than a rasp now, yet still carrying the weight of command. Behind him, lines of pilgrims dragged chains across the stones, their bare feet bleeding, each link a prayer that rattled louder than their voices. Outside, in the plazas, others knelt in hunger, waiting for a miracle that would never come. I watched as a woman lifted her infant toward the vaulted ceiling, her lips moving with a prayer I could not hear, and for an instant I believed the Emperor might answer. The air was charged, trembling with need. But when nothing descended, the silence came heavier than any sermon. The Brotherhood of the True Signal claimed victory nonetheless. They declared the vanished light proof that their angle of prayer had reached its target, that the Emperor had heard through their alignment.
They burned offerings of circuitry and iron filings, the air acrid with the scent of scorched insulation. Crowds gathered, coughing and weeping, desperate to believe that someone, somewhere, had succeeded in piercing the void. In the underhive, Mother Rawl's followers claimed their visions grew stronger. They brought her relics of rust and bone, and she assembled them into a figure of wire and scrap, a crude idol with sockets for eyes that never closed. It glared down at her flock like a god of broken things, and still they knelt. Even among the Arbites, fractures widened. Some troopers joined the Brotherhood, their visors left behind on shrine steps as if discipline itself had been unmasked. Others hardened, clinging more fiercely to the Aquila, flogging heretics in the plazas as warnings that no alternative faith could take root. It was a civil war of whispers, not yet of blades, but we all felt the edge. When faith itself becomes contested ground, there is nowhere left to retreat. I tried to keep my own prayers wordless, for words had become polluted by factions. In the chancery vaults, as I dipped my stylus into thinning ink, I simply closed my eyes and imagined light, any warmth, and willed it to mean the Emperor. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was only emptiness. Yet still, I prayed. For what else was there, in a world abandoned, but the persistence of faith? When the macro batteries thundered again, shaking the earth beneath our feet, the people surged out of their shrines to watch the heavens burn. To some, it was proof the Emperor armed us still. To others, it was merely the sound of machine spirits discharging their last reserves before falling silent forever. The truth mattered less than the hope it carried, for faith endures not because it is certain, but because it refuses to surrender. And so our world staggered forward, divided in creed, but united in one thing. We still believed, in some form, even if what we believed no longer resembled the Imperium that had once named us its own. The truth does not break cleanly when the Emperor's silence endures. It bends, warps, reshapes itself in the mouths of those too desperate to let emptiness remain empty. After years of hunger and raiders, after prayers answered only by echoes, memory itself began to decay, and into that rot, new truths sprouted like weeds through stone. Children who had never seen an imperial tithe ship came to believe such vessels were myths, stories invented by elders who still clung to parchment ledgers. When I passed through the agritiers one evening, I found a circle of them squatting around a guttering torch, playing at administratum clerks. They scribbled in the dirt with sticks, stamping their marks with pebbles, laughing as they pretended to tally shipments of food that never existed. Their game was not satire. It was their understanding of what I did in truth. In their eyes, a scribe was simply a teller of fairy tales, no more real than saints or angels. I could not bring myself to correct them.
In the manufacturer ruins, another kind of memory spread. The Brotherhood of the True Signal proclaimed that the Astronomican had always been a lie, that the light in the void was not a beacon, but a cage. They said the Emperor had hidden his true form behind silence, waiting until the galaxy was broken enough to be remade. Their chants grew sharper, harsher, and I began to see the faithful etching new sigils into the walls, marks that resembled the Aquila but twisted, its wings bent into unfamiliar geometries. They claimed these were corrections, the proper alignment at last. The Arbites tore them down where they could, but stone holds memory longer than flesh, and the marks returned each night. The ecclesiarchy fought to preserve the old words, but even their sermons bent under the pressure of hunger and grief. Father Uriel thundered still of trial and endurance, but I noticed him quoting scripture I had never heard before. His passages spoke of the Emperor walking not only as man upon Terra, but as shadow among the stars, testing not faith but fear. He swore these were recovered from lost canticles, fragments found in the cathedral's archives. Yet when I searched the records myself, I found no such writings. Perhaps they had always been there, overlooked. Perhaps he had written them in desperation. Perhaps, as some whispered,
The emperor himself placed them in his mouth. The underhive became a theater of mutation. Mother Rao's scrap idol grew taller with each offering, a tangle of bones and circuitry that stretched its arms like branches. Her followers painted their foreheads with rust and claimed their dreams were filled with voices, some saying the emperor spoke through the idol, others insisting the idol was the emperor. I watched one of her supplicants, a boy no older than 15, stare into the idol's socket eyes and sob as though reunited with his father. Who was I to tell him it was only junk and shadow? If meaning fed him better than bread, then perhaps it was more real than truth. Whispers spread of visions beyond the hive, in the salt flats where the raiders had landed their caskets. Survivors claimed to see golden figures walking at night, their armor radiant, their eyes hollow flames. Some swore they were custodians, come at last to judge us, but others said they were only revenants, the souls of our own dead clothed in illusions. I asked Doc Mistress Howe what she thought, and she shook her head. I saw lights, yes, but whether they were men or phantoms, I will not say. Truth has teeth now. Better not to feed it. Even among the scribes, truth began to fracture. My colleagues no longer copied ledgers faithfully. Some altered their records to show harvests doubled, as though the numbers themselves might coax the fields into obedience. Others undercounted the dead, insisting that to write every name was to surrender to despair. I tried to remain exact, my ink cutting reality into precise shapes, but I too felt the pull. On nights when the hunger bit hardest, I found myself adding numbers that did not exist. Shipments of grain, crates of last cells, tithe ships inbound in the next cycle. I never showed them to the governor, but they lived in my ledgers like ghosts of the world that had been. I told myself it was harmless, but ink is not harmless when the only history left is what we write. Rumors congealed into doctrine. Some claimed the emperor had left Terra entirely, ascending beyond even the Golden Throne, and it was his absence that starved us. Others argued he had died long ago, and what we worshipped was only the echo of his corpse. Heresy every syllable, but when silence stretches centuries long, heresy becomes indistinguishable from liturgy. I could not tell any more which was true. I only knew that what we remembered was not what the children believed, and what the children believed would one day become the only truth left. I realized, with a weight colder than hunger, that abandonment was not the loss of supplies or soldiers or sermons. Abandonment was the loss of memory, the slow replacement of what had been with what we wished had been. Truth itself was starving, and in its place, new myths feasted on our fear.
I found the first forgery by accident, slipped deep in the chancery stacks, where the air always smelled of old glue and vellum. It was a pilgrimage tract, bound in cheap leather, its title stamped with gold leaf that flaked beneath my thumb. The script imitated High Gothic well enough to flatter an untrained eye, and within it the author claimed to have walked the nave of Terra's highest cathedral and heard the emperor's breath rattle the incense chains. The lie was careful, not lurid. It named minor saints accurately, dated feasts that a novice could have checked, even reproduced marginal notae that only a scribe would know to invent. Had I not once copied the original calendar myself, I might have passed it along as truth. I should have burned it. Instead, I placed it in a drawer and wrote a report I never filed, then closed my hand around the drawer's key as if heat could pass from my palm into the metal and soften everything it locked. After that, forgeries multiplied like spores. Relics with freshly chiseled wear appeared on the cathedral steps, finger bones stained with rust to mimic age, datacog shards etched with devotional grooves too neat to have survived real use. Father Uriel denounced the trade and then held aloft a relic of his own discovery, a splinter of what he named the throne of a forgotten saint, and for one breath I believed simply because he did. The Brotherhood of the True Signal displayed a different treasure, a cracked auspex lens that they insisted bore the faint geometry of the Astronomican itself, proof the beacon had shifted into a new mode only they could interpret. Mother Rawl's idol grew eyes of polished glass, scavenged from a navigator's dead charting desk, and the sockets caught torchlight in a way that made even me step back. We were a city starving for certainties.
We ate whatever our hands could hold and called it sacrament. The governor convened what she called a concord of memory, a council to decide which truths we would carry forward and which we would let die. Tech priest Verana came armed with data scrolls and cool contempt. Father Uriel carried only a travel-worn book and a voice tethered to a fraying body. Doc Mistress Hal attended with a coil of chain at her belt, as if the weight steadied her. I stood behind them and made a record that could not decide whether it was minutes or confession. Verana argued for a canon of functioning. Keep only what a machine spirit will answer, discard any rite that consumes more oil than it yields. Uriel countered that without memory, a city is a hive of insects, all motion, no meaning. Hal said memory must be nailed to steel, or it slips. When the governor finally spoke, it was to say we would walk a middle path. The Manufactura rites pared to bone, the ecclesiarchal calendar trimmed to essentials, the brotherhood forbidden their roof fires and told to sing in silence. No one was satisfied, which may have been the only honest outcome left. In the weeks after, truths behaved like weather. One morning, the Eastern Tiers awoke to a rumor that Adeptus Custodes had been sighted moving along the salt flats, golden phantoms that left footprints of ash. By noon, 3 militia squads had sworn to have seen them, at different distances, at different heights, in different lights. By dusk, the story had shed the Custodes entirely and become a pilgrimage, 100 souls walking east to place their doubts on the ground and see if they burned. I went with them partway, compelled by a need I could not name, and found the flats pale and silent beneath a low, honest sky. Pilgrims knelt to touch the salt and rose with fingers that glittered. Some called it blessing, some called it frost. That night, the Vox carried a different kind of witness. A grainy transmission bled across the citywide band, a voice like a knife wrapped in cloth, claiming to speak from a ship in geosynchronous watch. It promised relief and commanded obedience. The voice did not know our codes, and when the governor demanded ident, it laughed softly and told the city to lay down its arms before dawn. The macro batteries spat thunder into the sky in answer, but the signal returned at intervals all evening, patient as a dripping tap. The Brotherhood proclaimed it a misaligned hymn and tried to harmonize their chant to cancel it. The chant spilled through the Vox as a metallic moan that made teeth ache. Verana traced the signal to a lattice of dish arrays the raiders had cobbled from our own broken towers and slammed crews into motion to tear them down. By morning, half the arrays were rubble, and the other half had moved. Truth was mobile now. It hit and ran. I dreamed then of the Archivum Primus on Terra, a place I had only known by its tracing in the margins of our oldest ledgers. In the dream, it was empty of clerks and full of wind, the stacks marching away into dark like regiments of giants waiting their turn to sleep. A man stood with his back to me at a table laid with blank vellum, and when he turned his face was light, and the light was hollowed with absence, and I woke with my pillow damp and my mouth tasting of ash. I told no one. Dreams had become a contested province, claimed by every sect and faction. I would not surrender mine to their ledgers. The children adjusted first, as children do. They stopped drawing the Aquila with equal wings and began to tilt one higher, as if it caught a wind the other did not. They played at scutari with sticks and sang the Brotherhood's glitched hymns in the tempo of the cathedral bells. They did not ask whether Terra would hear. They asked who would teach them to read the new signs faster. In their games, the governor's name survived as a rank. Father Uriel's as a verb meaning to speak when nothing answers, and mine as a joke. Don't Sarah it, they said, meaning do not write a thing down just to watch it die. Late in that season, an astropath in the sanctum laughed aloud, and then spoke a sentence in a voice that filled the stone like smoke. He said a word that might have been Terra, and another that might have been forgiveness. Then he died as lightly as a candle going out. The master of choirs insisted the sentence was authentic, that the pattern of pain etched in the astropath's brain matched the profiles of true sendings. Father Uriel wept in the nave when he heard, and called for a week of thanksgiving. Varana shrugged, and said the brain is a machine that will sometimes ring even when no hand touches it. The Brotherhood declared the message was theirs, an echo from the angle they had tuned, and Mother Rawl's idol tilted in a draft and nodded as if agreeing with all of them. I copied the sentence onto parchment, sealed it with the Aquila, and tucked one copy beneath my bed. It read like hope, translated through a dying mouth. On the night before the first snowfall dusted the Agratiers like flour for a feast we would not have, I met Dock Mistress Hall on the hangar roof again. She did not point to any light this time. She only handed me a length of the chain she wore and said I would know when to use it. Below us, the city muttered its prayers into the cold. Above us, the stars said nothing. Between those silences, truths multiplied in the dark, searching for hosts. I could feel them gathering at the edges of language, hungry for a mouth. Truth had become a weather system, and by the time winter's thin frost silvered the hive's terraces, no one agreed on which season we lived in. Some swore we were on the brink of deliverance. Others insisted we had already fallen into damnation. The truth mutated so quickly that yesterday's certainty was today's heresy, and tomorrow's laughter. I copied reports of sightings I did not believe, but I copied them all the same. One claimed that custodians had walked the salt flats, another that they were Necrons in golden guise. Some swore that the Emperor's own voice had poured from the idol in Mother Rawl's shrine, others that the voice was only a vent shifting in the heat. The governor demanded clarity, but clarity was gone. What remained were fragments, overheard, half-remembered, recorded by scribes like me who were too tired to argue. The children of the hive stopped speaking of Terra as a place. To them it became a direction, a mythic compass point. Walk Terra-ward, they said, when meaning east. Terra light, they called the first gleam of dawn. What had been history dissolved into metaphor, and in metaphor it endured. I tried to correct one boy, telling him Terra was real, a planet where the Emperor's throne still burned. He only laughed, showing teeth too sharp from hunger. If it is real, why does it not feed us? He asked. I had no answer. Even I began to feel memory thinning. In my dreams, the ledgers bled into smoke, the columns of numbers bending into symbols I could not read. I would wake with my quill in hand, pages smeared with ink that had no meaning. In the margins, I sometimes wrote words I did not recognize, as if someone else had borrowed my hand while I slept. When I read them by candlelight, I thought I almost recognized them. Not words of High Gothic, nor Benharic, but something older, deeper, more patient. I burned those pages before dawn, but their ghosts stayed in my mind. We had not been conquered by raiders, nor slaughtered by Xenos. Not yet. But the world I had known, the faith, the memory, the truth of being imperial was already gone. In its place stood something new, stitched from rumor, fed by silence, clothed in hunger. A truth that belonged to us alone, and not to the Emperor who had turned his gaze away.
By the time winter surrendered its crust of frost to rains the color of iron, the hive had learned the cadence of a life without answers. The macro batteries slept more than they woke, the manufactora spoke only in coughs, and the cathedral bells rang less to summon than to remember. I walked avenues narrowed by rubble, and found myself searching the sky the way a pauper searches pockets already turned out. Not for coin, but for a shape of mercy. The silence weighed the same as ever, but I had grown into it, like a scar that no longer stings unless you touch it wrong. Lord Governor Marshevale called me to the siege chamber and showed me the last machine we owned that still pretended to be grand.
It was a signal engine older than our oldest ledgers, a cogwork leviathan fused to a tower of black stone encrusted copper. The Mechanicus called it a heliovox. Its doctrine promised that, with enough will and oil and prayer, it could lash the upper air with a seam of light strong enough to scratch itself into the walls of the void. Not astropathy, not the Astronomican, a lighthouse for the blind. "We'll pour the city through its throat," the governor said, voice even, visor of calm lowered for the sake of those watching. "Heat, grid, every spare lumen, one night only. We will write our name so large the dark will have to see it." Varana stood nearby with her mechadendrites tucked like folded knives. "It will break," she warned without malice. "But yes, it will speak first." I didn't ask what we hoped would answer. A patrol or a crusade. A rogue trader with pity in his ledger. A ship that still remembered what the word imperial meant when stamped in wax and blood. We cataloged the cost the way a scribe counts the dead, honestly and too late. Lights would die across the tiers. Heating would falter. The cathedral would go dim. Father Hierophant Uriel came anyway, set one hand on the heliovox's hide, and whispered a blessing. "A word thrown into a canyon may yet find a face on the far wall," he said, voice more breath than sound. Dock Mistress Hall brought chain by chain a procession of volunteers who would haul counterweights and crank flywheels when the engine choked. The Satiri set their stances along the gantries like the teeth of a closed jaw. I took my place at a slate to mark timings no one would read twice. The day we chose was a day the raiders never came. Perhaps they felt the city pull in its breath. Perhaps luck, that feral thing, curled at our feet for an hour and decided to purr. The hive dimmed according to plan. A dusk that slid down every tier, and for a fragile moment we were one thing again. A world with its hands on a single machine. On Varana's mark, crews she had trained in a language of clicks and nods roused the heliovox. Pistons shuddered, belts spun. The engine's heart found a rhythm like a giant learning to breathe. Heat climbed the tower until frost bled from the stone in runnels, steaming in the cold. When the lens cap, older than our oldest saints, rolled aside, the light that leapt out was not a beam, but a column, a pale spear that stabbed upward until the night swallowed it whole. It carried no words that we could hear. It carried our waste heat, our dwindled power, our thin belief that signal and salvation shared a root. Nothing answered at first. A priest would say patience. A scribe would say wait long enough and ink becomes dust. We held anyway. The city's grid dipped into brown and then into the shade of old copper. The cathedral's nave bruised itself into gloom. The manufactora, those that still pretended, fell fully asleep. On the terraces, people stood hatless and stared, lips moving as if the light were a litany. We kept the column steady for a full watch. Satiri hands blistered beneath their gauntlets. Chain burned Dock Mistress Hall's palms, and she did not let go. Father Hierophant Uriel knelt and did not rise. I marked time by the ache in my back and the slow failure of my stylus to find new ink. Varana counted aloud in a voice that made arithmetic sound like prayer. And then the engine began to die. Not with drama, with the tired sigh of an old thing that has already gone farther than it promised. The column thinned, the lens fogged with breath it could not spend. Varana gave a single, small nod, and the governor, who had not blinked in an hour, lowered her hand.
The light fell away as if the night had closed its mouth. For a long minute, the city made no sound. Even the wind in the upper works paused to listen to our disappointment. I felt something in my chest loosen, as if a stitch had come undone. Men and women drifted from the terraces, coats tighter, heads low, each of us carrying a share of the silence back to our corners. The heliovox ticked as it cooled. Varana rested her forehead against its frame the way a pilgrim touches a saint's tomb. Father Uriel whispered to the stone.
I pressed my palm to the casement and felt heat trapped beneath the metal, the last of our word moving toward nothing. I had reached the stairwell when the voxnet cracked like ice and spilled a single sound that did not belong to us. Not speech, not a code. A tone, thin and sustained, too pure to be accident, too patient to be refusal. It lifted the hair on my neck. People froze in doorways. The tone shifted once, a measured interval, and then steadied again. A second tone joined it from another band, as if two strings had been plucked in the dark. Verana's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had watched 1,000 honest failures, brightened the way oil catches a spark. "Not ours," she said, "not ours." The governor did not move. She said only, "Hold." The city did in a way I had not seen since the silence first closed its fist. We stood in dim halls and cold streets as those two notes braided themselves through our bones. The tone did not identify, it did not promise, it was the shape of attention. To a starving world, attention tasted like bread. The band died as suddenly as it had come. In the ringing that followed, the macro batteries boomed a heartbeat apart as their machine spirits, jealous and proud, threw their own punctuation into the sky. Light flared again along the tower's seam, uncommanded, some last cough of the heliovox, or a reply, or a trick of frost. People argued about it before the echo finished returning from the hive's far walls. The Brotherhood called it a harmonization. Father Uriel called it a mercy. Doc Mistress Hal said only, "chain," and coiled hers again with hands that bled. We learned nothing we could stamp. No ident code, no transponder, no name to write in a ledger's clean line. But the void had made a sound, and the city slept that night with mouths closed less tight. I dreamed of the archivum again, and woke with my hand on an invisible page. In the morning, the raiders returned as if to remind us what scale our lives were measured in. Sirens ripped the air, the planetary guns woke and shouted. The militia ran on legs that had eaten too little. In the siege chamber, the governor drew a circle around an empty portion of the map and said, "There. We will not let them take that." It was a neighborhood I knew only by the names on ration books. I copied orders until my wrist ached and watched as Doc Mistress Hal took her place on a wall, and Father Uriel took his in a doorway, and Verana took hers beneath a killed machine to coax one more hour from it. We did what abandoned worlds do. We held until something gave that was not us. The raiders pressed harder that season, as if the faint voice from the void had roused them too. They struck like wolves at the edges of the hive, testing, never risking a full assault. Each strike stole something we could not replace. Food stores, promethium caches, even people dragged screaming into the dark. And yet what amazed me was not the taking, but the endurance. For every quarter that collapsed, another found a way to live. Families boiled shoe leather into broth. Manufactura corpses were gutted and turned into shelters. Children learned the shape of hunger, but still played in the rubble, drawing crooked aquilas in the dust.
I carried the governor's decrees on brittle parchment, stamping them with seals that smelled of hot wax and desperation. Most were lies, orders declaring victories that had not been won, supply shipments that would never arrive. But when I walked through the streets to post them, I saw eyes lift toward me with the same hunger they gave the cathedral's altars. The people needed words as much as bread, perhaps more. A rumor passed through the hive that one day the emperor would ask to see our records, and if the numbers showed that we had not given up, he would return. I knew it was a child's fantasy. Still, I sharpened my quill each morning. And then, one dawn, the vox crackled again, not with tones this time, but with a voice, thin, distorted, impossible to place. Some swore it was human, others said it was Xeno's trickery. It spoke no names, gave no coordinates, only a phrase that echoed in every channel at once. What remains endures.
3 words, repeated until the static swallowed them. For hours the hive froze, every soul waiting for more. But nothing came. The Brotherhood declared it proof of their doctrine that the signal had answered their alignment. Father Uriel wept openly, calling it the Emperor's benediction. Doc Mistress Hal clenched her jaw and said nothing. For myself, I copied the phrase in my ledger until the page was black with ink. I did not know whose voice it was. I only knew it was not silence. And after so many years of silence, even the smallest murmur felt like salvation. The voice never returned. The weeks that followed were measured not in victories, but in how long we could last before the next raid, the next famine, the next night when the streets turned on themselves. Yet the memory of those 3 words lingered, carved deeper than any decree or sermon. I heard them whispered in ration lines, scratched into the walls of manufactura, murmured by children as they fell asleep. What remains endures. It was not promise. It was not rescue. It was simply survival given shape. And somehow, it was enough.
Father Uriel died in his sleep before spring's thaw. The cathedral bells rang for him once, and then fell silent. There was no strength left to toll them longer. Dock Mistress Hal vanished during a raid at the docks. Whether taken or fallen, no one knew. Tech Priest Varama endured, her flesh growing gaunter as her augmetics gleamed brighter, until she seemed less a woman than a shrine of iron that refused to kneel. The governor remained at her post, voice steady over the vox even as her body thinned to a shadow. And I remained in the chancery, still writing, though my ledgers had become less record than prayer. By then, the children no longer asked who the emperor was. They spoke instead of the chain, of the idol, of the light that once burned above the agri-tears. They carried forward not the history of the Imperium, but the fragments it had left behind. I realized with the cold clarity of a scribe at the end of a column that this was the true fate of abandoned worlds, not sudden death, not glorious last stands, but the slow transmutation of memory into myth, myth into faith, faith into something unrecognizable yet still alive. I closed my final ledger with a seal that meant nothing to anyone but me, and set it on the chancery shelf among the others. If no one ever read it, still it would stand, a testimony that we had existed, that we had not vanished utterly into the silence. Outside, the sky bled crimson with another raid, and the macro batteries coughed their thunder into the void. But I thought of the voice, thin and fragile, threading itself through static, and I repeated it beneath my breath like a catechism. What remains endures. Perhaps one day, centuries from now, a crusade will find this place. Perhaps they will find only ruins. Or perhaps they will find a people who have made themselves into something the Imperium no longer recognizes. Either way, it will not matter, for in the dark we endured, and that endurance is the only truth left.